Have you ever felt like your life was already written for you, before you had the chance to hold the pen? Like every decision, every label, every expectation was stamped on your skin before you could breathe your own name? This story is for you. I was supposed to die in chapter 27. I remember the exact moment I turned to the page. The sky outside was gray with the weight of an approaching storm, the kind that presses its fingers against the windows and whispers warnings no one ever listens to. My fingers were shaking, not with fear, yet, but with something deeper, that uncanny sense that the book already knew I was about to betray it. The Book of Fate sat on my lap like a verdict, bound in stiff black leather, sealed with the gold crest of the Ink Council. The moment I broke that seal, the world should have stopped. But it didn't. Birds still chirped outside, wind still stirred the curtains. The silence in my chest, that was the only thing that changed. Everyone received their story at 17. It was tradition, law, destiny, if you believed the council's sermons. At the ceremony, they told us the books would guide us, keep us on the proper narrative path. They said those who strayed invited chaos. Those who defied it invited erasure. I broke the third rule first. Never read ahead. It wasn't a curiosity. It wasn't a rebellion. It was desperation. A thrum under my skin, like I needed to know what the world had written before it could write me. So I flipped through the opening chapters, skimming the prose of my life with detached cynicism. Page after page detailed things I hadn't told anyone. How I once stole a shard of mirror from the attic and stared into it for hours, convinced it would show me something truer than my reflection. How I buried my first sketchbook because the drawings weren't part of approved creative channels. How I lied to Elle about what I dreamed. It knew everything. And then I found it. Chapter 27. Her breath caught once, then stopped altogether. The marble caught her weight. Her story ended, and the scene turned silent. I didn't cry. Not immediately. I reread the sentence 4 times, searching for a footnote, a revision, something scribbled in the margins. But there was nothing. Just those words, cold as carved stone. My blood, yes, mine, was described in poetic detail, as if someone had taken pleasure in scripting my end like an art piece, as if my death was meant to be beautiful. A strange clarity settled over me then, like I'd stepped outside of the narrative entirely. I looked at the book, still warm from my hands, and for the first time in my life, I felt unscripted. I didn't scream when I reached for the candle. I didn't hesitate when I touched the flame to the corner of the page. The ink bled like oil, thick and alive, curling as it resisted the fire, then surrendered. I held the book in both hands as it burned, its weight growing lighter with every second. The flames didn't flicker. They consumed with purpose, as if they too had waited for this moment. And when the final page twisted into ash, I wrapped it in silk, white, the same color the narrators wore, and walked barefoot through the morning dew to the ivy altar where the reading ceremony had taken place. I buried the ashes there, beneath roots that had wound themselves into neat patterns the council deemed narratively symmetrical. I pressed my hands to the soil as if sealing a grave, and for a moment I thought I heard the wind shift, like the trees themselves were unsure what to do with someone who no longer had a script. My name is Calith Arden. Or maybe it was. The version of me they wrote died in that book. I buried her too. The world we lived in wasn't governed by leaders or laws. It was ruled by ink. That wasn't metaphor. Every decision, every breath, every relationship had a place in the Book of Fates. If you strayed, the narrators came, always in white, always smiling. They'd realign you. And if you were too far gone, if your plot had frayed too much, they erased you. The erasures were quiet. No announcements, no mourning. Just a name disappearing from the daily roll call, a chair suddenly missing from class, a friend's laugh fading in memory until it felt fictional. People learned not to ask questions. They called it mercy. My parents were devout followers of the ink. They framed their books like portraits in the living room. My mother once told me that knowing the exact hour of her death made her feel serene. The author has already planned the ending, so I don't have. "If you too," she said, sipping her tea like that was normal, like that was comfort. I used to nod, smile, pretend I found it peaceful too. But something inside me had always pulled against the current. When I was younger, I used to draw new chapters, scenes that never happened but should have. I imagined myself in other genres. A runaway, a warrior, a villain. Anything but the soft, sacrificial girl they'd written. I buried those sketches behind bricks in the attic. Even back then, I knew the ink didn't like improvisation. They say the books align us with our narrative threads. I used to think that meant harmony. Now I realize it meant obedience, chains, disguised as structure. At school, they trained us to walk through our scenes with grace. We practiced dialogue, tone, pacing. Some students rehearsed their deaths like theater soliloquies. One girl sobbed through her entire midterm performance because her death required weeping with artistic restraint. The teachers applauded her. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stayed quiet. I watched. I listened for the moments when people stuttered over words not their own. When a smile came a beat too late, when a hug lingered longer than the script allowed. Those were the cracks. And I was learning how to widen them. I began to notice things. Teachers correcting students with eerily similar phrasing, like they were reading from a prompt. Morning announcements that included character notes instead of schedules. The word authentic lost all meaning. Everyone clutched their books with reverence. They kissed the seal. They recited their opening lines at assemblies like they were gospel. But not me. I walked through the day with soot under my nails and silence in my throat. I didn't need a script anymore. I'd already chosen my next line. I would write it myself. So when I passed the narrators that afternoon, two of them standing by the school gates, smiling too wide, scanning the crowd for signs of deviance, I didn't flinch. I met their eyes, let them see nothing, just another girl living her assigned plot. And yet beneath my calm was a fire that hadn't gone out with the book. It burned in my chest, low and steady. They hadn't noticed yet, but they would. I was no longer a character, I was a glitch, and I had just cut the first thread. I didn't scream, I didn't flinch. I ended the ending before it could end me. I didn't run, I didn't rebel, not outwardly. After the book burned, I walked back into the world exactly as they'd written me, quiet, obedient, composed, the perfect daughter, the ideal student, the tragic girl who smiled at the right lines, blinked at the right pauses, and lowered her eyes just before any suspicion could rise. I folded myself into their narrative like a blade inside silk. It was easy. Too easy, maybe. People don't notice silence when they've been taught to fear noise. But beneath that silence, I watched. I watched how fate threaded itself through the people around me like marionette strings dipped in gold ink. Elle's smile, once natural, spontaneous, now arrived on cue, polished and delayed. She'd laugh, then glance away like waiting for something unseen to tell her what came next. When she spoke, her words sometimes paused mid-sentence, just a beat too long, before continuing, as if someone had pressed play again. No one else noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to see. That was the difference between obedience and survival. Some played along, and some performed. In the weeks after my defiance, I studied the choreography of our world like an understudy memorizing a doomed routine. My classmates repeated lines they didn't write, complimented each other in identical phrasings, cried with eerily similar cadences. Our teacher, Mr. Levan, who wore thin glasses and taught narrative studies, had a favorite phrase when correcting students: "Stay aligned with your thread, or you'll tangle others." He said it so often I began mouthing it with him. But the threads were already fraying. I could see it, in the girl who wrote the same sentence 20 times in her journal like she was trying to overwrite her own thoughts. In the boy who laughed too early during a performance scene and was escorted out by a narrator, never to return. In the way the announcements started to glitch, voices stuttering, names repeated, silences cutting through the words like slashes. They called it background static, a normal artifact of high-volume narrative systems. But I knew better. It was rot, and I was the first crack. Sometimes I remembered how my mother used to stroke the spine of her book like it was a pet. She'd sit by the window and reread her chapters, whispering them aloud like scripture. I meet him in chapter 8. We marry in 11. I die quietly in 32. Her voice would soften at that last poi. Art, proud and resigned. I used to think she was strong for accepting her fate so gracefully. Now I saw it for what it was. Surrender, written in cursive. There were flashbacks I couldn't suppress anymore. Moments that resurfaced like bruises pressed beneath memory. I remembered being 7 and drawing a picture of myself with wings, bright red ones. I showed it to my father, expecting awe. He frowned, handed me my book, and said, "But you're not written to fly, Caliph." That was the first time I buried something. Another time, I wanted to audition for a role that didn't appear until chapter 18, 2 years ahead of my age bracket. I was told, "You're only in 3 acts, don't overstep your genre." I remember how cold the floor was as I knelt to apologize, how I rehearsed regret even though I didn't feel it. But I'd learned, the better you acted, the less they watched you. Still, the illusion had limits. At night, when the rehearsals ended and my room dimmed to soft lamplight, I'd open the small locked drawer beneath my desk. Inside it were fragments of the burned book, curled black corners, bits of gold leaf, and the page I'd torn just before setting it all ablaze. Not a passage, but the back cover, where a single word had been scribbled over and over again in ink that shimmered differently than the rest. RX. I traced the name with the pad of my thumb. It wasn't mine, but it felt like it belonged to me, like it was speaking across time, across ink. None of the other students' books had handwriting in them, at least, not that I'd seen. Their books were pristine, printed, impersonal, as if they'd been pressed off a machine conveyor and sealed with fate. But mine had been altered, annotated, touched. And if someone had written in it, then someone had written for me. That thought haunted me. Oryx. Who were they? Why was their name scribbled in the margins beside crossed-out sentences? Why did one note point an arrow at the paragraph describing my first heartbreak and say, "Optional if she deviates early"? It was like someone had planned for me to escape the script. That terrified me more than the council, because it meant I wasn't the first to disobey. It meant someone else tried and failed, and yet they'd left a breadcrumb trail for me, one I hadn't noticed until the ashes cooled. I looked at Elle differently after that. She still sat beside me at lunch, still texted in the shared shorthand we'd created in middle school, still asked about my dreams like she didn't already know the answer, but her eyes flickered too often, her voice hesitated too deliberately. And when I looked into her book by accident, just a quick glance, I saw it. Chapter 23. Betrayal. My name printed beneath it. I should have confronted her, raged, demanded answers. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew she hadn't chosen it. Not fully. She was following her line, just as I had, for 17 years. And part of me, a terrible, selfish part, wanted to see how it would play out. What would she say? Would she cry? Would she lie and say she never meant to? Would she look relieved? I began preparing for it like one prepares for a winter storm, quietly, layer by layer. There was something deeply wrong with me, I realized. A part of me that had cracked too cleanly, a part that now found comfort in prediction, that no longer wanted to escape the page, but watch it tear itself apart. I still smiled at Elle, still walked beside her, still hugged her when she offered it. But every time her arms circled my waist, I imagined the tracker sliding under my bed, the narrators waiting just out of view, and I waited. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see if she'd do it. If she'd speak her lines. If she'd flinch. My name was still Caliph Arden, but the girl who bore it, she had stopped playing nice, and the story was starting to notice. The library had always smelled of quiet decay, paper and dust, and the slow rot of obedience. Its floors creaked with history, and the rows whispered as if the books themselves remembered every breath ever stolen within. These walls. We were taught to walk it with reverence, never touching the upper shelves unless called to, never opening a volume that wasn't ours. But reverence had died the day I set my story on fire. Now I moved like a shadow, unseen, untouched, unafraid. I waited until dusk, when the corridors emptied and the archivists locked the outer doors with their soft ceremonial clicks. I had memorized their pattern over weeks. Left shelf first, then the wall panel, then the silver lever beneath the fifth light sconce. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't righteous. I was just tired of pretending the answers weren't there. The restricted stacks lay beneath the west wing, buried under a labyrinth of forgotten blueprints and mythologies deemed non-canonical. They were not meant to be entered by characters like me, those without council sanction or legacy clearance. But the name scrawled in the back of my book had etched itself into my mind like a brand. RX. I needed to know who he was, why he'd written in my margins, why his presence lingered in the ashes I'd buried like a second heartbeat. I slipped through the archival gates and descended the spiral stairs, fingers grazing the rusted rail, the scent of cold ink thickening as I went deeper. The air felt different down here, charged, like lightning held its breath. I passed rows of sealed tomes, each bearing silver clasps and titles in ancient glyphs, names I didn't recognize, faces drawn in rough charcoal. Some books were chained, humming faintly with magic or memory. Then I saw it. A slender volume, bound in deep gray leather, fraying at the corners. No lock, no crest, just 3 words on the spine, etched by hand. Oryx Revan, the Instigator. My breath caught. For the first time in weeks, I hesitated. What if it was a trap? What if someone had planted this knowing I'd search? But curiosity, no, hunger, overruled doubt. My fingers brushed the cover. It was warm, not just in the way of old leather, alive. I opened it, blank, page after page, cream-colored, untouched. But it wasn't empty. It felt like it was waiting. And then, near the center, pressed into the parchment with such force that the sheet had torn slightly, a single line. If you're reading this, you're not dead, which means I failed. But you don't have to. I stared at the sentence until my vision blurred. It was dated, 26 years ago, my birth year. I should have laughed, or cried, or run, but all I could do was clutch the book to my chest and listen to the silence thrum like a drum beat. I wasn't the first. I wasn't some accidental glitch. Someone, this RX, had tried to escape the narrative before. He had written into mine. He knew me. The lights above flickered, a warning. I slipped the book into my coat and fled back into the night, the echo of those 13 words chasing me up the stairs like a ghost I'd just invited home. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my window with the curtains half drawn, the city humming beneath the glass, the sky swollen with clouds that refused to rain. My room felt smaller, or maybe I'd just grown into something larger. The book lay open beside me, its blank pages seeming to breathe in rhythm with my own. I wanted to speak to it, but words felt too small, too rehearsed. So instead, I reached for my pen, not to write, to sharpen. I carved the metal tip into a finer point, longer, angled like a blade. When I pressed it to my palm, a bead of blood rose instantly, red, vivid, real. The ink of my own body. I stared at it, transfixed. This wasn't printed. This wasn't planned. This was mine. Ink binds, I whispered, voice shaking. But blood remembers. I let the blood drip onto a blank sheet of paper and watched it bloom. It didn't form letters. It didn't speak prophecy. But it stayed. That meant something. That proved something. I thought of the drawings I used to hide, versions of myself with wings, with fangs, with fire in my mouth. I remembered burying them because they weren't canon, because creativity outside the script was punishable. And now I wished I'd drawn more, wished I'd spoken louder, wished I had believed that my thoughts, my story, mattered. Outside, the wind picked up. The street lamps blinked once, twice, then went still. I felt it then. A ripple. Not in the room, not even in the building, but in the narrative itself. Like something had stirred beneath the surface of the world. A misstep, a pulse out of sync, a line that had been deleted but was trying to rewrite itself. Was it the book I'd burned? Was it the sentence RX left for me? Or had the story always been unstable, cracking slowly under the weight of too many false smiles and scripted betrayals? I stood and moved to my mirror. My reflection stared back, unchanged. Dark eyes, pale mouth, a thin scar near my left brow from falling on the academy stairs in year 10. But something beneath my skin looked different, like the outline of myself was flickering, just slightly, like I wasn't fully rendered. I pressed my palm to the glass and whispered his name. RX Revan. The mirror didn't answer. But behind my eyes, something opened. A memory? No. A message. Not in words, not in sound, but in sensation, like the first inhale after drowning. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't finished. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eye. As I stayed awake until dawn, watching the horizon glitch in places no one else could see. And for the first time since burning my fate, I started to believe I was meant to do something bigger than survive. I was meant to ignite. They came at dawn, not with shouting or alarms, not with pounding fists or glass shattering beneath boots. They came like a whisper you almost miss in your sleep. Soft, white, inevitable. I knew they would. The moment the sun slid its thin gold blade across the floorboards and touched the edge of my pillow, I felt the breath of the narrative shift, like it exhaled in relief. I didn't flinch. I simply opened my eyes and sat up, hands folded in my lap. When I turned toward the door, it opened in sync with my movement. Two narrators stepped in, identical in height and expressionless in gaze. One carried a black case. The other held a folded slip of paper, no doubt my extraction order, although neither read it aloud. They didn't need to. This scene was pre-written. I stood without being told. The silence between us was clinical, polished, like we were part of a dress rehearsal I hadn't been invited to, but had somehow memorized anyway. And then I saw her. Elle stood behind them. Not hiding, not weeping, just there. Her hair was tied back, too neat, too clean. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for something. An apology. An answer. Or maybe she wasn't searching at all. Maybe she was waiting for me to say something, to make it easier. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch between us like wire. If she needed a confession, she'd have to pry it from the part of me that had already died. She didn't cry. Her betrayal was mechanical, flawless. Her expression only cracked for a second when she whispered, almost too quietly, "I didn't want to." I wanted to ask if she rehearsed that line, if she'd practiced it in the mirror before the narrators arrived. But I didn't speak, because I understood now. Wanting didn't matter. Not in this world, wanting had no place on the page unless the author made room for it. They placed my wrists into cuffs that weren't cold. That disturbed me more than anything. They felt warm, like someone had worn them just before me, like they were passed down, an heirloom of punishment. The walk to the vehicle was short, quiet. The streets were empty, no morning joggers, no school children. The council always timed these things carefully. No audience, no questions. Inside the van, the walls were padded white. The floor hummed with static, and the air smelled like rubbed graphite, metallic, scorched. There were no windows, only silence. Time didn't pass. It folded. One blink, another, then the white room. They didn't call it that, but everyone knew. No shadows, no corners, no doors once you were inside, just smooth white walls, floor to ceiling, that curved in places your eyes couldn't follow. It was like being swallowed by blank paper. The cuffs clicked away, and I was alone, until I wasn't. He entered without sound. No footsteps, no door. He simply arrived. He wasn't old, not like I expected. The system made you think the enforcers would be ancient and brittle with power, but he was young, early 30s maybe, dark hair cropped close, skin pale like old pages, gloves black and wet-looking, stained to the wrists as though dipped in ink. His eyes were unreadable, neither cruel nor kind, just quiet. "The editor," I said, not a question. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Caliph Arden." Hearing my name from his mouth was like hearing a secret spoken aloud. I hated how calm it sounded. "You weren't meant to be a threat," he said, tilting his head slightly, like I was a misprinted paragraph he hadn't expected to review. I met his gaze. "Then why am I caged like one?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, gloves clasped behind his back like a teacher preparing a lesson. "What did your book say before you burned it?" I almost said nothing, almost let the silence sit between us like a dare, but I wanted to know what he thought he'd gain from the answer. "I never read it," I lied. His smile didn't change, but something in the air around him did, tensed, warped. "Then you have no idea what you've become." A chill slid down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, because I had an idea, and it terrified them. The rest of the day, or hours, or minutes, I couldn't tell, passed in silence. I wasn't questioned. I wasn't tortured. I was simply placed in the blank. The white room muffled time. I tried to count seconds, then tried to speak aloud. The sound bounced back at me strangely, not echoing, just returning. It was like the room was reading me. The editor didn't return that night, if it was night. At some point, I fell asleep on the floor. Cold seeped into my bones. My breath turned to mist. My thoughts wandered to the sound of Elle's voice, the soft break when she said, "I didn't want to." Did she watch them dried? Of me away? Did she feel anything when she turned back to her story and flipped to chapter 24? Maybe this was what the council called alignment. Maybe betrayal was just another inked instruction. But I wasn't a line anymore. I pressed my fingers to the floor and whispered the only thing I had left. Caliph Arden. Again. Caliph Arden. The name didn't echo. It is rooted. I said it louder. Caliph Arden. Not because I needed to hear it, but because they needed to. They'd tried to erase me, but I remembered. And as long as I remembered my name, they hadn't won. Caliph Arden. Caliph Arden. The food tray slid in without ceremony, same as every other day. I didn't move at first. I'd stopped pretending to be surprised by their routines. They brought me rice, tea, and 2 slices of something that looked like a memory stripped of flavor. But today, it was Elle. I didn't look at her right away. She stood at the edge of the threshold, barely inside the room, like even one step too far would tear her from her story. Her shoulders were stiff, her eyes darker than I remembered, shadows pooled beneath them like ink that had dried too long in the open. "You're not supposed to be here," I said softly. Her throat bobbed with an unsaid word. "I only have 5 minutes." I wanted to ask if she was here to apologize, to explain, to plead. But when I finally met her gaze, I saw it. Not regret, not guilt. Fear. Her fingers trembled as she pushed the tray toward me. "Eat something." "I don't think your script allows for mercy," I said, my voice flat, cool. "Unless they rewrote you again." She winced. "Caliph, did you practice that too?" I asked, standing slowly. "Did you get notes on how to whisper my name like it still belonged to you?" She didn't respond, just placed one hand flat on the white table and whispered, "You always asked the wrong questions." And then she turned and walked out. Not one word more, not a backward glance. The door sealed with a final sigh of pressure, and I was left with silence and steam. I didn't touch the food, but I lifted the tray. Underneath it, taped beneath the porcelain, folded 3 times, sealed with wax that smelled like old ash and cedar, was a note. I peeled it open slowly, every movement a breath stolen from a world that didn't want me breathing. "Oryx was your uncle. He started the rewrites. You are the last line he wrote before they erased him." I stared at the note until the edges blurred. RX. That name had haunted the margins of my book, whispered from burned parchment, bled from my own questions. I had imagined him as a rogue scholar, a forgotten dissident, a myth. But he was family. Flashback unfurled slowly, like a ribbon pulled loose from an old chest. I was 6. It was snowing. My Uncle RX had visited during the winter revision holiday, a brief reprieve between semesters. He was the only one who ever spoke to me like I wasn't fragile, like I was fire not yet given shape. He knelt beside me as I stacked books too high and whispered, "You know, Caliph, not all stories are written to be followed." I'd laughed, unsure what he meant. I remembered how his eyes crinkled, how he smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He told me bedtime stories, strange ones, about girls who outran their names, about kings whose crowns turned to paper in the rain. He'd draw sketches in the margins of my notebooks, a cracked quill, a moth in mid-flight, a girl walking away from a burning page. My mother scolded him after he left. "Don't fill her head with broken patterns. She's meant for alignment." But he never came back. They told me he'd relocated to the North Archive. Now I knew what they meant. He'd been erased, but not before writing to me. A rebel born not of accident, but intention. I sat back against the cold wall and tried to breathe, but my lungs felt filled with ink, my heart stuttering like an overwritten paragraph. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't a glitch. I was a seed. And now, I was germinating. That night, the silence changed. It no longer watched me. It waited. The lights dimmed, not all at once, but in slow increments. First the wall glow, then the floor's edge, then the strip near the ceiling that buzzed like a sleeping god. And then, click, the lock. It unlatched itself. A mechanical sigh, subtle as a breath. I stood, pulse hammering, every instinct screaming trap, but the air didn't feel hostile. It felt open. The door creaked as I pushed it. The corridor beyond was dark, lined in soft white, and every camera I passed turned away at the moment my shadow crossed its path. Guards sat frozen mid-movement. One with a pen paused inches above a clipboard, another reaching for a door that would never open. Time was folding. Someone was helping me. Or perhaps, someone had written this escape long ago. I didn't run. I walked, careful, poised, the steps of a character who'd finally found her own pacing. I passed through gates that had never opened for anyone but the council. I exited the compound beneath a sky streaked with gray, the moon hidden behind clouds that looked like smudged erasures. By the time my feet reached the ivy altar, it had started to rain. Not a downpour, a cleansing. I fell to my knees, digging with bare hands into the soil where I had buried the ashes. The silk cloth was damp, the fabric clinging to my fingers as I lifted it, trembling. My breath caught. One page remained. Curled at the edge, singed but whole, it had somehow survived, folded into the inner lining of the silk, protected like a secret. I didn't cry, but something inside me shifted. A lock turned inward. My uncle hadn't left a message. He'd left a command, and I was finally ready to obey it. The rain had stopped by morning, but the ground still carried its memory. The ivy altar dripped slowly, as if mourning the pages I never got to read. But I had the one that mattered, the one my uncle left behind, the one that had waited, not just to be read, but to be seen. Write the next chapter. The ink hadn't been visible when I first unfolded the page. It had risen as I stared at it, like heat coaxing steam from the surface of still water. The letters weren't sharp or neat. They were almost trembling, alive, as though they were still in the act of becoming. I ran my fingers along the sentence, and for the first time since I burned my book of fate, I felt no fear, no ache, no restraint. I didn't want to tear the page. I wanted to fill it. They had written me to die in chapter 27. But now I was writing myself past it. The walk back into the city was different. I didn't hide in shadows. I didn't glance over my shoulder. I walked like someone with a purpose the world hadn't accounted for. The streets didn't try to stop me. They seemed to tilt beneath my steps, guiding me forward. By the time I returned to the academy courtyard, people were already speaking in half sentences, as if their minds were misaligned with their scripts. The daily announcements stuttered, starting mid-line and ending in static. A teacher forgot his own subject mid-lecture, blinked twice, and then left the room without explanation. And the names. They were fading. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in slow, flickering patterns, like candles running out of air. The screens that once listed student rosters now glitched with slashes and blanks. One girl looked at her ID card and whispered, "This isn't mine anymore," before throwing it away. They were unbinding, so I began to speak. Not loudly, not in classrooms or sermons, but in fragments. Whispers traded in hallways, words etched into desk corners, ink dropped into already fading books. I would lean into someone's ear and say, "You don't have to follow it." I would write a new name on the edge of a student's page and watch their eyes widen, pupils dilating like memory returning. The effect was slow, gentle, but it worked. Some disappeared entirely, not erased, but released. One boy simply walked out of the east gate and faded into mist. Another stopped responding to her character name and began humming songs never taught. Some sobbed when their words returned to them, like a voice long stolen and finally returned. I found an old chalk shard behind the eastern stairwell and took it to the council's front wall. It was white stone, polished, untouched. I pressed the chalk to it and wrote, "Burns." A wind howled then, sudden and sharp, like the world trying to swallow my defiance, but the name stayed, even as the chalk crumbled, even as my fingers bled from how hard I pressed. I didn't look away from the wall. Not when footsteps approached. Not when a shadow fell across mine. It was Elle. She was wearing a coat I hadn't seen before. Her hair was down, unbraided. Her shoes were mismatched, as if she'd dressed in a hurry or rebellion. In her hands, blank parchment. I didn't speak first. She did. "Tell me what comes next, Caliph." Her voice didn't shake this time. It was a question and a surrender all at once. I looked her in the eyes. There was no ink behind them now, just exhaustion, just want. "We stop obeying," I said, and she nodded. No argument, no debate. We were past permission. Later, I would sit beneath the old birch tree near the library, the one with roots that had always split the walkway, roots they threatened to cut down every year for narrative symmetry. I pressed my hand to the bark, whispering names of people I barely remembered, people who had vanished before me. One by one, I said their names aloud, let them drift like petals. And that's when he came. The editor. He didn't wear gloves this time. His hands were clean, though they trembled faintly. He didn't say hello, just stood beside me, watching the courtyard flicker, students moving like ghosts half-bound to forgotten scenes. "You've infected the narrative," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. A scholar facing a text that no longer obeyed structure. I didn't rise. I let the silence stretch until it softened. "No," I replied. "I've liberated it." He didn't answer, just turned and walked away. No threat, no warning. Because he knew he couldn't stop it now. It had already begun. They had given us books to bind us, pages to trap us. But we had stories of our own. And for the first time, they were writing back. That night, the moon rose red behind the council hall. Names changed, doors unlocked, and every blank page waited, trembling, for someone to claim it. The city was quiet when I walked through it, quieter than I'd ever heard. Not the silence of order or suppression, but the stunned stillness of a world caught mid-breath. The sun was just cresting the rooftops, throwing long ribbons of light across the stone paths, turning glass windows into fragments of fire, and everywhere I looked, the names were unraveling. Some flickered, pulsing faintly on digital boards as though unsure of their own shape. Others froze, mid-scroll, mid-spoken phrase. Some were gone entirely, leaving only blank space where identity used to sit like a collar around the throat. But no one panicked. No one screamed. They just watched, like something sacred was slipping its mask. A boy walked past me with his book of fate in his hands. It was open to the middle, where once lines would have guided him word by word. Now the pages were blank. He wasn't crying. He wasn't confused. He was humming a tune I didn't recognize. His name tag, once pinned neatly to his chest, now simply read, "Let me decide." Another girl stood near the fountain, her fingers slowly tracing the surface of a brand new book. It had no seal, no title, just potential. And then, the children. Small hands gripping leather-bound volumes with fresh pages, unmarked by prophecy. They clutched them like talismans, some drawing stars in the margins, others scribbling words they hadn't dared speak aloud before. Their eyes weren't empty. They were alive. Free. I kept walking. Each step echoed louder than the last. The buildings I passed still bore the scars of the old world. Banners with council slogans, metallic plaques listing approved behavioral archetypes, even statues of long-dead narrators carved in the act of writing. But something in the air had changed. The ink binding those structures had dried out, brittle, cracked. A girl was drawing over one of the statues with blue chalk, laughing softly. It didn't matter if it washed away. It mattered that she could. I paused outside the academy. The glass doors reflected back someone I almost didn't recognize. My posture straighter, my face unreadable, my eyes unbound. For years I had been written to die in chapter 27. Now there were no chapters. Only choices. Only me. A small tug on my coat broke the reverie. I looked down. A child, no more than 6, stood beside me, cheeks flushed, a blank book clutched to her chest. Ink smudged her fingertips like bruises made of memory. Her eyes, large, hopeful, searched mine like I was the last page in a story she hadn't yet learned to read. She tilted her head. "What happens if the stories come back?" Her voice wasn't afraid, just curious, like someone wondering if monsters still lived under the bed. I knelt slowly, letting the wind settle between us. My hands found hers, small, ink-stained, shaking just a little. I brushed my thumb over the smudge on her knuckle and looked into her eyes. Then we write louder. She blinked and smiled. Somewhere above us, the morning wind rose, soft at first, then stronger, carrying with it a sound I hadn't heard since before the ceremony. Pages, turning, thousands of them. I stood and turned. From the balcony of the council hall, once sealed, once sacred, reams of blank paper now poured into the sky like birds released from a cage. Some caught on rooftops. Some danced between alleyways. Some landed in the hands of people who'd never held a pen by choice. Each one shimmered faintly, not with prophecy, but with possibility. They were waiting to be filled with new names, new endings, new beginnings. And somewhere inside me, something ancient and blood-bound, something my uncle whispered into the seams of my soul before the council erased his voice, rose like fire through my chest. Not a scream, not a speech, just a truth. We were never the story. We were the authors. And now, they couldn't unread us. I walked into the square, bare palms open to the wind, eyes forward, voice steady. "Choose your name," I said to no one and everyone. "Choose your page. We're not waiting for the author anymore." The sun rose, and behind me, 1,000 stories began. This story isn't just about Calith burning her fate. It's about all of us choosing to write louder when the world tries to silence us. You are not what they named you. You are what you create. So here's the question only you can answer. If someone handed you a blank book today, what would you name your first chapter? Drop your title in the comments below. Let's fill this space with new beginnings. And if this story reminded you that your voice matters, hit that like button, subscribe for more manhwa stories that see you, and remember, your next chapter starts right now.